Hello, everyone. Today, we will listen to a story about a woman's adultery. One day, a woman named and decided to change her life and find a job at a good company as a manager. She found out about a vacancy at a prestigious firm and decided to send her resume. However, after several weeks of waiting, and received a rejection from the company. She was of course upset but did not give up. She began to self-develop and improve her skills to increase her chances of getting the job she wanted. After several months of searching and found another job opening at the same company, she carefully researched the requirements and prepared a good resume. She was invited to an interview which she successfully passed. In the end, I got an offer to work for the company as a manager and now works for a good firm. She is happy and proud of her achievement. Before that, she mostly sat at home waiting for her husband from work, providing comfort and harmony. Her husband Thomas, who worked in a private lawyer's office, was not particularly happy about his wife's employment, but how lonely she was at home alone. Because they had just moved to another city, and they had few friends and acquaintances here. And was doing well at her job. But as usual in any firm, there is a change of personnel, and here it was time for the manager to leave for a well-deserved rest. In his place, sent a young handsome man. And since most of the team were women, the tall broad-shouldered athlete was appreciated by many. And was modest by nature, but she too could not refrain from appreciating her superiors. A few days later, the new boss Brian Stark decided to hold a corporate party to get to know the staff better. Almost everyone took part in preparing for the party. And didn't miss out on attending either. She was young and slender, and Brian immediately spotted her. He approached her as she was setting the table. She needed to get the glasses from the top cabinet, but since she was short in stature, she had a hard time reaching them. Brian came up close behind her and reached his hand over her outstretched arm. It seemed like he was about to touch her. And it almost happened, but Brian pulled his hand further out and got the cups and felt a kind of confusion. "Thank you," she said softly. "You're welcome." Brian smiled. There was music playing in the hall, and after a few glasses of champagne, some people were dancing, some were talking about work, and some were discussing Brian. And chatted with a colleague. "Yes. He's a handsome man." Mary, who was single, glanced over and over. "Let's see what he has in store for us." Not all candy in a pretty wrapper is sweet, and was trying hard to stand on her feet. The champagne was really getting to her head. "I think I'll go out and freshen up a bit. I don't feel so good." She went out to the balcony. To her surprise, Brian was already there smoking and talking to someone on the phone. Somehow, she hadn't noticed him coming out. In anticipation of future developments, and decided to return to the room. "There's enough room in here for two." Brian's voice stopped her. "I didn't mean to disturb your conversation, Mr. Stark. Please call me Brian. It's not like we're on the board of directors." He moved closer to her. Suddenly, she felt his hand on her shoulder. She felt hot. And the champagne made her even more. The champagne made her even more tipsy. "I don't feel good," and try to stop the situation which was taking on a non-work nature. "Can I give you a ride?" The suggestion sounded harmless, and after some deliberation and agreed. It was already dark enough. The car drove at a low speed along a poorly lit road. Houses and trees flashed by. The sky was clear and the full moon was shining. And sat in the front seat trying to see her house, but they kept going and going. Then she saw that they were going in the wrong direction. "But we're going in the wrong direction," she tried to argue. "I hope you don't mind having a cup of coffee first, or your husband won't be happy that his wife is drunk." And look thoughtfully out the door window. Brian was probably right. After all, even though Thomas adored her, he would still be very jealous and might not understand why, and came back in such a state. And without even telling his that there was a corporate party going on at work. "I guess you're right," she whispered. Brian looked at her with his head turned slightly toward her and touched her cheek. After a while, they arrived at Brian's house. "When we going to have coffee?" and was frightened. "Yes. My coffee at home is very wonderful. It's more invigorating than anything else," smoked the man. The night passed like the blink of an eye and woke up in a strange bed. She began to remember what had happened the night before, and suddenly she was horrified. She was with Brian. She resisted what had happened, but at the same time, she loved being with him. But what to tell Thomas? And looked at her phone. 8 missed calls from Thomas. Her whole life flashed before her eyes. Then she thought of asking Mary, with whom she'd become friends, for help. "Hello, Mary," and spoke hopefully. "Oops, the missing person is here. Where have you been? Your husband called me." That's it. F.A. And was already mentally divorced. And saying goodbye to her glamorous life. "Hello. Anne, can you hear me? I understand you've decided to visit the Cage of Paradise. Don't be afraid. I've got you covered. I said you with me." Mary's words finally made and breathing begin to recover. "But you owe me one. Remember, we have a quarterly report to write. So do it for me. You have a talent for this kind of thing." "Oh, Mary. Oh, thank you." There was a loud sigh of relief coming out of Anne's lungs. "Of course, I'll help you." Yes. Mary liked her new boss and she even ended Anne, but she had a tough job and couldn't pass up the chance to make myself job easier. 2 months passed. And then Brian's romance developed rapidly. Sometimes she would stay with him and Mary would cover for her for certain favors. But Thomas did not let go of his jealousy and became suspicious of his wife at every step. Their family began to have spats to the point of scandals. And felt like she was between two fires. She loved Thomas deeply, but at the same time, she was very happy with Brian. She had known her husband for a long time and in different situations he supported her. His jealousy never interfered with her. She hardly knew the new boss, but he beckoned to her like nectar to a bee. She needed to stop all meetings outside the office, but she couldn't. As soon as she tried to hint to Brian about it, he would touch her arm and her thoughts would fog up. Thomas couldn't help suspecting that his wife wasn't just going to work. He began to visit her at the office on various pretexts. But every time and managed to get away with it. Mary was a great help in this. Mary was determined not to be left with nothing, and during her visits to Thomas, she began to really like him. "So why should she have two and I have none?" she said to herself. It hurt her that fate was not as favorable to her as it was to her colleague. One day, she made up her mind. And when Thomas visited them again at lunchtime, she pinned him down in the coffee shop. "Excuse me, Mary, I'm looking for Anne. Where is she? She doesn't want you. She doesn't love you. She's all about her work." Mary almost let it slip. "What do you mean by that?" His eyes locked on her in a questioning expression. She tried to dodge the answer, but she didn't want to let Thomas go either. Yes. And the prospect of a personal slave suited her. But no matter how she went about it, she couldn't have it all at once. A choice had to be made. Mary filled her lungs full of air and tried to distract Thomas. Without thinking anything of it, she clung to him with a firm kiss and hugged him as tightly as a boa constrictor to his prey. A dazed Thomas didn't immediately realize what was happening. For a moment, he even responded to her. But a few moments later, he pulled the girl away from him. "What are you doing? Are you out of your mind?" He pushed her away and walked out of the room. "Thomas, she didn't quite know what she'd done," Mary said after the man left disappointed. She stood still for a few minutes, pondering the course of events. Images of what had happened over the past 2 months flashed through her mind. Anger and passion overwhelmed her. She had to do something, but she could not know how to begin. This evening Thomas came home late and came home early. He came in from the hallway into the kitchen and stopped in the doorway to see his wife sitting at the table with a cup of tea in her hands. She was looking at him as if she wanted to ask him something but could not say a word. Her terrible secret was stuck in her throat in a sharp lump. Thomas was silent. He just stared at her and did not leave the doorway. Their silence was disturbed by a phone call. Anne. Anne. Mary shouted into the receiver. There's been an accident. Her screams were interrupted by sobs. Her screams were so loud, even Thomas could hear them. Mary, what has happened? Don't shout, say it calmly. Mr. Stark. He's in the hospital. He was shot. Ah. And froze at what she heard. She only looked at her husband, who had decided to sit down at the family table after all. He was surprisingly calm, and hadn't seen him like that in a long time. He seemed to have lost all emotion. He just kept looking at his wife. Jesus. Thomas. Did you hear that? Mr. Stark, he was shot. She put the phone on the table. Yes. I'm aware of that. We've already heard from the police. Thomas' silence finally broke. But how? Who could have done this? And looked at the table at a loss, as if she were trying to find an answer? For some more time, Thomas was silent again, as if observing his wife's reaction. He examined her every movement, trying to catch the slightest hint that would help him know everything about her outside the house. That would help him see what was in her soul. A robbery, they say. And he is in serious condition, he said, stretching the sentence a little. I want to visit him. Will you come with me? And pretended to be an innocent sheep, pretending to be just a caring employee. Even though she was so anxious to see Brian, even if it was just for the last time. She couldn't believe it was a robbery. When she left, everything was fine. Brian, and Mary was still in the office. Oh, my God. Was it really Mary? I mean, she was jealous of him. She really liked him from the beginning, but he chose me. And thought, so are you coming? Snapping up from the table, and asked her husband again. No need to go. So much the better, it will be quieter, she thought, and grabbed her jacket and ran out into the street. It was only now that tears flowed from her eyes, when number one was watching, that she could cry. It was a shame for her to lose such a man. She caught herself thinking that she wanted a divorce and to be free. Free with Brian. But now it was too late. Too late. As she sat behind the wheel, and tried to get the key into the lock with her trembling hand, but it wouldn't work. She leaned against the steering wheel, sobbing loudly. She slapped the steering wheel with her hands several times, then with a deep sigh repeated the manipulation with the key. The car started and drove off, at which time a heavy downpour began, but nothing could stop her. Overwhelmed with thoughts of Brian, she pressed harder and harder on the gas to get to him. Visibility on the road was poor, and the windshield wipers couldn't keep up with the raindrops. Her tears also made it difficult for her to see anything. Suddenly, out of nowhere, the headlights of an oncoming car came on, speeding right at her, and started to brake, but the brakes didn't work. And then lights flashed before her eyes. She heard the barely audible words of the ambulance staff. She saw them carrying her down the corridor, and again, silence and darkness, and wakes up in a hospital room. Sitting by her bedside was Thomas. A white robe was slung over his shoulders, and he was looking away into the void. When Thomas heard his wife move, he turned his gaze to her. How are you? How are you feeling? And could not answer at once. Her throat was dry. She wanted to drink water. Thomas understood and handed her a glass. I told you no need to go, but you didn't listen. I just wanted to visit him, she said quietly. Mary was with him. Why were you so eager to see him? And didn't know what to say at the moment. She was overwhelmed with feelings. She didn't even know how to answer her own questions. She was completely confused about her actions and thoughts. She just wanted to run away. At that moment, Mary entered the room. Her face portrayed sadness and misery. "And how are you?" her friend asked. "How am I? How am I? Why is everyone picking on my well-being? Can't you see Thoran?" She realized what a mistake she had made when she succumbed to Brian's law. And now she was tormented by the fact that there was nothing she could do to change it. It was too late. Too late for her, and especially too late for him. How is he? How is Brian? As she waited for Mary to answer and realized something was wrong. The pause, which seemed eternal, was interrupted by Thomas's answer. He looked at her again as if he were trying to see inside her. "He is dead." It sounded dry and insensitive. Everything blurred before the eyes of the already wounded girl. Was this really the end? She didn't even say goodbye to him. After a moment's silence, and dared to ask the question that tormented her. "Tell me the truth, Mary. Did you shoot him and didn't care about anything else?" She realized that Thomas knew, or at least guessed, about her relationship with Brian. Mary's face contorted with bewilderment at those words. How could you think that?" Mary sobbed. "You dirty Hall." With those words, she ran out of the room, slamming the door loudly, and still didn't understand. Was she right or wrong? Or was she wrong? After all, there was no one else to hurt him. Or she looked at her husband, who was sitting perfectly still in his chair, expressing no emotion, just staring intently at his wife. He stood up and leaned toward her. "And you are so naive. It wasn't Mary's fault." He whispered in her ear. "You know the truth, don't you?" Thomas pulled away slightly to look into her eyes, which were now overflowing with terror. He smoked and leaned into her ear again. "I saw you in his office when I came to see you. Anne. Oh, Anne. Believe me, he wasn't in as much pain as I was." Thomas Leslie returned to his chair and stared at his wife again. "Did you? How could you?" "I'll tell the police everything." Sir Thomas put his finger to her lips. "You won't tell. You can't prove anything." "My little Anne, and the car? Is that you too? Why did the brakes fail?" "I remember. Did you want to kill me?" She was having trouble breathing. She began to choke. Thomas stared at his wife again for several seconds in silence. "No. And remember, you were so anxious to get to him. You have to be careful what you wish for." He slowly rose from his chair and continued to choke. From the corridor, the paramedics could be heard rushing to help.